Hi everyone, this is your intro video for week 8. I want to use the few minutes of this video to sort of situate our study of Matthew at the juncture that we're at in the story, segue a little bit from what we did last week to what is coming this week and the next couple weeks, focused on Jerusalem. I also want to say a brief word about grades for our class in light of some questions that have come in. And finally, a few comments at the end on the anti-Jewish structure of the Christian tradition that we have inherited and that we need to work on in the way that we read Matthew, the way that we imagine what it means to be Christian, who others are in light of how we understand ourselves as Christians, and some of the ramifications of the structure of the Christian tradition that to a large extent we have inherited. So first of all, a segue from last week until this week. Last week Jesus began his movement directly towards Jerusalem after his disciples through Peter have declared him the Messiah openly for the first time in the story, and then him telling his apostles to their horror that what it means to be the Messiah is for him to die a shameful death at the hands of their corrupt authorities in Jerusalem. And in the midst of that scene in Caesarea Philippi, Jesus says something that I think is just hard for us to digest without glossing over it. And I'm saying this in part just thinking through some of what I read in your posts of last week. What it is he tells his disciples, once they have declared him the Messiah, that he doesn't want them to tell anyone else that he's the Messiah. He does not want them to begin announcing that he's the Messiah. Somehow, who Jesus is as the Messiah is revealed in his not wanting his disciples to tell people yet that he is the Messiah. It's telling us something about in what his messiahship consists. So I don't want you to gloss over that, because I think that in many ways it is challenging to some of our, especially evangelical sensibilities, where we assume that when it comes to bearing witness to the truth, what we should always do is give answers that are straightforward, full of right angles, no room for ambiguity or any lack of clarity. And that's just not the Jesus that we find in this story. What it means for him to be the Messiah is full of all kinds of subtlety and complexity that pat answers simply cannot capture. And the way I might say it is that there's something about who Jesus is as the Messiah that has to be revealed in how his life clashes with authorities actually unfold over the course of the story. Not just in the words on the mouths or in the mouths of the people who want to claim him as their Messiah. So I hope that will trouble you a little bit and perhaps inform your sense of the subtlety that needs to characterize the way that we bear witness as Christian disciples to who Jesus is. It's not a matter of just giving pat answers, stating the obvious, reiterating the sort of standard lines. There's something that is missed about who Jesus is when he becomes an easy answer. So I hope you'll continue to reflect on that. Of course, from that point, as we saw last week, Jesus has been forming his disciples now as the church or community that he is building up within Israel that is going to play a decisive role in bringing the life of God, kingdom of God, uh, into Israel, into the world, bearing witness to God's work in overcoming the forces of decay and death and the fear of death and the violence that that stimulates in the coming age. So obviously this takes us to finally the doorstep of Jerusalem, as Jesus has now predicted 3 distinct times in the narrative to his disciples that he is going up to Jerusalem to die. As I said last week, adding a layer to what this death will be like each time. I think a layer in each case that adds to the horror of it in the minds of his disciples. And in each case, of course, concluding this prediction with the anticipation of being raised from the dead on the 3rd day, I think a claim that his disciples can hardly understand at this stage in the story. There's no expectation that there's the isolated resurrection of a single person in their memory or how they have been formed as members of the diverse Jewish community that they are. When we get to the doorstep of Jerusalem, the region of Bethphage, on the Mount of Olives, we're going to have to take note of change, I think, in the tone, the pace, the drama even of the story. Suddenly the pace slows down. In these last 7 or 8 chapters, a fourth of this whole gospel, only a week or 2 go by, whereas far more time has been covered in similar amounts of text in the preceding segments of the story. And as Jesus rides in to Jerusalem in the most ironic of fashions, there is suddenly a sort of explosion of symphony of Scripture. Scriptural quotations have, of course, punctuated the presentation of the gospel story according to Matthew up until this point, but on the way into Jerusalem, there is an explosion of scriptural quotations, one after the next. And that should give us a sense of how we are nearing the climax of the story, the climax of Israel's hopes. And it's, I suppose, characteristic of Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the place that the songs for the hopes of Zion, that they've been about for centuries. It's the place where the liturgy of the Psalter is performed and repeated over and over again, the place where Israel's scriptural memory is concentrated, especially with respect to the hopes that were cultivated from Abraham down through the generations of Israel after the Exodus, under the kingdom of David, and on finally to really the age of the prophets that arises with the kings, and again seems to store Israel's hopes in the place of Jerusalem, specifically the temple in Jerusalem. And that place is where we're approaching, and consequently there is suddenly cymbals clashing or crashing, all kinds of scriptural music, you might say, that begins to fill the story. Now, as we move through these scenes, I think for many of us, we will be coming into some perhaps more familiar parts of this gospel story to us. That's both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is you might have a better sense of sort of where you are in the story. The disadvantage, however, is that the familiarity of the words and some of the images can lead you to gloss over details that don't fit the picture that you have developed of this segment of the story. So just want to urge you to uh, read as carefully as you can as we begin to move through scenes that are more familiar to us, and hopefully find details that trip you up and force you to sort of reimagine the picture that you're working with of this part of the story of the gospel. This uh, part of the story, of course, not surprisingly, involves a heightening of the tension to really open clashes with the Jewish authorities that are concentrated in Jerusalem and around the institution of the temple. And this gives us, I think, an opportunity to address what I hope has become a theme of this class, which is the tendency that the Christian tradition has had of telling the story of Jesus on the backs of the Jews, making Christian claims to the truth on the backs of the Jewish community, as if the greater Jesus is, the more we have to demonize the Jews who rejected him, or something of that nature. I hope you'll find the array of characters and interactions far more complex than that. You're going to hear me dealing with the particularity of these characters and the exchanges between Jesus and them in some detail in my comments on this segment of the narrative. But I just want to urge you once again to be wary of false generalizations that you will be apt to introduce into the story about the Jews or things like that, and to remember that, as we've said in earlier moments of the class, the ramifications of telling the Christian story, making sense of the Christian life with the Jews as the foil, have been monstrous, far more than I think we're even able to name. The Holocaust is in some ways the tip of the iceberg, because there's a whole Christian imagination of purity and difference, social difference, who the true people of God are, who the true nationals are, who really belongs, who's the in-group, who's not, the criteria for that, ramifications of that kind that have resulted from this anti-Jewish structure to the Christian tradition and sort of standard understandings of the Christian faith. So let's try to develop something a little bit more nuanced in the way that we read the interactions between Jesus, who is a Jew, with certain kinds of other Jews, especially authorities among those Jews. I've assigned a couple of articles. One of them is required, the other one is optional for this week. The required one is by a Jewish scholar named Shia Cohen, the optional one by Ulrich Lutz. And I hope that the article by Cohen, and if you read the one by Lutz too, great, but will give you a sense of the complexity of the Jewish milieu that we're reading about, and perhaps help you to see that Jesus and his disciples, their criticism of the Jewish establishment was not unique to them. There were other Jews as well, especially in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, that lodged some of the same criticisms that we find Jesus lodging against the Jewish authorities. And they weren't doing that as Christians. They were doing that simply as Jews who were trying to pick up the pieces after total catastrophe for the Jewish community in the war with Rome, 66 to 70, finally petering out in 73 or so. So hopefully that will give you some food for thought as you read the story and reflect on the complexities of the Jewish milieu in which it's unfolding. And I hope come away from the next couple of weeks wise enough not to romanticize the Jews as if everything Jewish is fabulous, or to demonize the Jews as if uh, everything about the Jews is against Jesus, or something like that. Instead, to be able to see in the Jewish milieu precisely the kind of complexity that continues to characterize uh, the lives that we're living today in the various communities that we find ourselves a part of. Final comment just on grades here. Some of you have written just wanting to make sure that you're understanding how the grades work. Just the reminder is that for the weekly posts, the initial responses that you post to the response forums, I'm grading those on a pass-fail basis. I'm giving you a number, usually between 3 and 5, but if you submitted it on time and followed the instructions and got something between a 3 and a 5, you're going to get full credit for those posts. If you submitted them late without some kind of arrangement with me, then I will always try to give you some credit, because I always want to encourage you to do work that you've missed rather than depriving you of an incentive to do it. And it will usually be something like half credit or something like that. The grade for the comments that you're making on your colleagues, fellow students' posts is the same, although I'm not marking it because sometimes you're adding comments to various posts, and I just thought that would get a little bit too unruly. So just remember that if you are offering the number of comments that are required, it's about 200 words per week across a variety of your fellow students' posts. It can be one fellow student, could be many. You're going to get full credit. You will be getting your first formal assignment, the interpretive working paper, back from me in the next few days, and that will have a more conventional grade on it. I should just let you know that my approach to grading those might be a little bit intimidating, because I tend to give a lot of comments just throughout your paper, and I don't want you to interpret everything that I write down as a criticism. I view my comments as an ongoing dialogue with you. So there will be some criticism, of course, but also just remarks of insight that you show, observations you make that are fabulous, ways I'm learning with you. And you'll always find at the end of your paper a brief paragraph where I try to help you focus on a particular area or two of your paper. Focus on that as you move towards the advanced interpretive paper, which is the next assignment due week 10. The instructions for that assignment are in this week's material, so that you can begin to think about that. But just bear that in mind as you're reading my comments, and I hope that what those comments do and the focus that I give you at the end is to help orient you as you begin putting together your advanced interpretive working paper, in which you've moved from a kind of exploratory phase in the working paper to a phase in which you are ready to settle on a particular interpretation of the passage that you express in a kind of summary way as a thesis in the beginning, and then devote your paper to clarifying, to substantiating, to defending. So the instructions for that, like I say, are in this week's work, and Once again, I will be available on Friday at 10 a.m. For a video conference with you if you want to dial in and discuss that or any other questions or concerns that you have about the course or the assignments. Have a great week. Hope that you find this rather intense segment of the narrative illuminating and inspiring to you as a Christian.